Western Governors Drought Forum webinars. Today's webinar is titled Managing Forest Health for Water Resources. I'm Carly Brown, Water Policy Advisor at the Western Governors Association. Just a quick note, if you are in need of technical assistance, please message Amy Schweig through the WebEx application or call WGA at 303-623-9378. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to describe the Western Governors Drought Forum initiative and go over a few logistics for today's webinar. First of all, the Western Governors Drought Forum is the chairman's initiative of Governor Brian Sandoval of Nevada. As chairman of WGA, Governor Sandoval asked us to help create a framework for sharing best practices. So far, we've done that by having a workshop series of meetings all across the western states focusing on different economic sectors and looking at the way that drought impacts those sectors. Then we identified through that workshop series common themes to dive into through this webinar series. We've also been collecting best practices and case studies and all types of different information that we're archiving online at our Drought Forum online resource library located at westgov.org. I hope that through the course of this webinar you'll be able to find out a little bit more about the Drought Forum, but we urge you to go online to the webinar or to the website, or you can always give me a call or email at cbrown@westgov.org. Quickly, I'll go through the logistics for the webinar before I turn it over. Today, our moderator is Chief Ken Pimlott, who is the Director of CAL FIRE and is also the California State Forester. He will have the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment. In today's webinar, each panelist will deliver brief opening remarks, and then Chief Pimlott will ask a few questions of the panelists to begin discussion. If you have any questions, please send those to me, Carly Brown, through the WebEx application using the question function or the chat function, and I will pass those along to Chief Pimlott so that he can direct them to the speakers. All attendees are currently on mute. We're going to be handling the questions through the text application instead of verbal questions. A recording of this webinar will be available by Friday, and you will get an email with information about that recording, so you can pass that along to colleagues if they couldn't join today. Again, for technical assistance, please message Amy Schweig through the WebEx application or call WGA at 303-623-9378. And with all of those details out of the way, I would like to introduce our moderator, Chief Ken Pimlott.
Hi, good morning, and thank you, Carly. Great panel discussion set for today. What I would like to do is first introduce our three panelists and then give a short introduction. So today on the panel, we have Alan Hook, Water Resource Analyst for the City of Santa Fe Water Division, Marcus Robles, Conservation Science Specialist with the Nature Conservancy, and Don Boucher, Project Manager with the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, United States Forest Service. So as an overview today, we know that the West is comprised of over 36 million acres of forest land, almost half of the nation's forested area. The primary trends and threats facing Western forests, and quite frankly the forest across the nation, include changing ownership patterns, increased wildland-urban interface, wildland fire, invasive species, and elevated levels of insect and disease mortality. These trends affect all lands, regardless of ownership. Similarly, they affect all people, threatening the basic assets we need and often take for granted, such as clean air, abundant water, safe communities, open spaces, and economic opportunities. The impacts of sustained drought threaten all of these values and assets. In particular, the threat of fire continues to grow across the West. On your screen, you can see a great example and illustration of just 4 years in California, looking at Half Dome from 2011 to 2015 on the same date in March. And it's a very stark comparison of conditions and how they've changed just in those 4 years. And right along with that, the average length of fire season has increased significantly across the West. In some areas, fire season is really year-round. The total acreage burned and number of large fires are increasing in most western states. Montana, for example, has experienced over 4 million acres of forest land burning in uncharacteristic wildfire over the last decade. And in California, over half of the state's 20 largest fires have occurred just since 2002. The relentless drought has left vegetation parched and ripe to burn again in 2015. These at-risk forested landscapes have a direct impact on water storage and quality, which is now a precious and scarce commodity across the West. The 2013 Rim Fire, for example, was the third largest fire in California's historical records and threatened the Hetch Hetchy Watershed, critical to San Francisco's water supply. As the threats to forests and watersheds increase across the West, it is more important than ever not to work in silos. We must collaborate at all levels of government, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, tribal communities, utilities, academia, and a variety of community-based groups. We must leverage all of our resources to be most effective in these endeavors. Today, we will hear 3 presentations involving innovative and collaborative efforts to address forest cover and watershed management. And with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, again, Alan Hook, Water Resource Analyst with the City of Santa Fe Water Division.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Hook, and I'm the Program Manager for the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed Program. And I'd like to thank the Western Governors Association for the invitation today to speak about our management program. So next slide, please. And I just wanted to give you some perspective here. This is the Santa Fe River watershed. Basically, we're in the Rio Grande Basin, and the Santa Fe River itself starts in the headwaters, about 11,500 feet in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The Santa Fe River runs through the city of Santa Fe and heads west and then meets up with the Rio Grande. So next slide, please. What I'm going to speak to specifically is what we term the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed. So that's the easternmost portion of the Santa Fe River watershed. It's approximately 17,000 acres, and it's administered, the lands are administered by the Forest Service. The city of Santa Fe also owns property within the municipal watershed. So what's unique about Santa Fe Municipal Watershed is that it's been closed since 1932 by order of the Secretary of Agriculture. And part of the reason for that was a lot of inundation and water quality effects. So Santa Fe basically receives about 40% of its drinking water from the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed, so it's an important source of our drinking water supply. And the community, the city of Santa Fe, the Forest Service, also the Nature Conservancy, and a local nonprofit called the Santa Fe Watershed Association really recognize, as well as the community, the need and need for protection of our water source. So they created a collaborative effort back in 2009 under a Forest Service Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program funding to put together this plan. Next slide, please. So what was the motivation? Again, wildfires. It was definitely in the community's mind. You'll see in the map to the left, this sort of shows a history of 1970 through 2012 of a lot of the wildfires that occurred around the Santa Fe River watershed. In particular, in 2011, we had a very large fire called the Los Conchas Fire, and it burned about 156,000 plus acres to the west of Santa Fe in the Jemez Mountains, but the effects definitely could be felt around the community and just the threat to even our watershed of the possibility of wildfire. So next slide, please. So some of the numbers, I mean, the likelihood we're in a high severity threat watershed just because of the densities of the forest around the Santa Fe River watershed. So we have a 1 in 5 chance in any given year the lightning started fire could occur. Some of the numbers that were put together for the plan was that basically a 10,000 to 40,000 acre fire could have impact within our municipal watershed and cost us between $11.9 million and $48 million just on suppression costs and impacts. Without forest treatment, wildfire could definitely fill our reservoirs with sediments and ash, So it was calculated what would that cost us to basically dredge 2,000 acre-feet from our 2 reservoirs within the municipal watershed. And that was calculated to cost about between $80 million to $240 million. Next slide, please. So given that understanding, in 2009, the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed Plan was drafted, and we've since then amended it in 2013. And there's really 4 main components. There's the vegetation management, which is that had been worked out with the Forest Service. We have water management, which the City of Santa Fe Water Division is really the controller on that aspect. We have outreach and education. We do a lot of elementary school programs, a lot of hikes for families and adults to understand what's going on in their watershed and understand their water source. And then there's financial management, which was originally done with the Nature Conservancy as part of the plan. One of the unique things of our watershed management plan is that we have a collection agreement with the Forest Service. So the Santa Fe National Forest basically has a 50-50 cost share collection agreement, which really allows us a lot of flexibility on treatments, both thinning and prescribed burn for different times of the year. So if the funds are not available for the Forest Service, we, the city, match those funds. So those ongoing project costs are paid for by our water utility customers within their utility bill for each month, because the community felt like they would be the direct beneficiaries of this plan, and also the thinning and the collection agreement with the Forest Service. So next slide, please. So looking forward to the future, pretty much with this plan, the City of Santa Fe's dedicated about $4 million in our budget for the next 20 years, so that's starting in 2010 through 2029. So looking back at how much has been treated in the lower portion, so primarily in the map that you see to the left, the lower watershed, which is what we call the non-wilderness area of our municipal watershed, over 5,000 acres have been treated, and that's since 2002. And we hope to be continuing the treatments, again, into the future with a commitment of the public and our water rate payers. But also we're looking, we've started an environmental assessment into the wilderness areas. So the crosshatch area of the upper municipal watershed, we're looking at some of the treatments, again, to mitigate wildfire from having their effects on our 2 reservoirs within the municipal watershed. And that would be in the Pecos wilderness area, which, again, wilderness area, you can't do mechanical thinning. There's a different set of rules, but we've started the EA process on that. So next slide. And finally, to wrap up, just to emphasize, again, the watershed management program is unique because, one, it includes our utility rate payers, but it's also a collaborative effort between the Forest Service, the City of Santa Fe, both our water division and fire department. Nature Conservancy was a group really spearheading this effort, and again, the Santa Fe Watershed Association on a lot of our outreach and education. So at this point, I can stand for any questions, and I can answer anything specifically or send information if anybody likes. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I think what we're going to do is hold the questions to the end. And what we'd like to do now is first of all, an outstanding example of the issues we're talking about, and we do look forward to talking more at the end. We are working through an audio challenge with Marcos, so at the moment we will now pivot to Don Boucher and ask Don to give his opening remarks.
Sure. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this project. The Ashland Forest Resiliency Stewardship Project is it's located in southwest Oregon, adjacent to the community of Ashland. And on the slide, you can see the city located in the bottom part and going up to the top of Mount Ashland. And the municipal watershed itself is about 15,000 acres, and it's about 90% owned by the or operated by the Forest Service. there's a little bit of city-owned land in there. The project itself, which we usually refer to as AFR, was first conceived in 2004 to try and reduce fuels within the watershed to protect water quality primarily, and also late successional habitat. The entire project area is located in the late successional reserve and is critical habitat for the northern spotted owl. When we first started operating the project, or the proposal, the community actually offered up an alternative to the Forest Service proposal, and through the analysis process, we actually selected the community alternative to implement in the watershed. And that was developed by a group of community members that represented a wide range of interests. Next slide, please. So the project itself is a 10-year project to complete over 7,600 acres of treatments, which includes non-commercial work to reduce surface and ladder fuels to try to keep fire out of the canopy. It includes removal of commercial products that through stewardship have been used to offset some of the costs that we're incurring. And also prescribed burning is a pretty major element of this whole proposal, in that we intend to use prescribed fire to maintain all of these treatments over time. Next slide. This is just a shot of Reeder Reservoir, which contains essentially all the drinking water for the city of Ashland. And that's a community of about 20,000 residents, and the total income from that is about $5 million a year for the water that's paid to the city. Again, this is all on Forest Service land for the most part, and we'll talk about how the city has contributed. Next slide, please. A couple of recent fires have really put the issue in mind. The 2009 Siskiyou fire, which occurred just right on the south end of Ashland, and fortunately was contained to only a little over 100 acres and only burned one residence. And then in a couple of years later, 2011, the Oak Knoll fire, actually, though it wasn't adjacent to the watershed, it did burn 12 homes in a matter of just less than an hour. So the community is well aware of the risk of fire, and so there is a lot of support for doing the treatments in the watershed. Next slide, please. So we developed the stewardship formally in 2010. The Forest Service received some American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funding for the stimulus dollars. And so we went to several partners, and you hit the button again. Yeah, thank you. The City of Ashland, the Nature Conservancy, and Lomacasi Restoration Project, all nonprofit groups under the Stewardship Authority, came together. We kind of identified some roles for our to implement the project, basically. The Forest Service came with the funding and the kind of oversight of the project. The City of Ashland had some technical expertise to offer, in that they had actually done work on some of their forest lands. And also a huge part of their effort was involved around the community engagement, going out and speaking with the community and getting feedback. The Nature Conservancy is kind of responsible for the multi-party monitoring aspect of it, and so they put together all the interested stakeholders and developed a very rigorous monitoring plan, which has been implemented over the first 5 years of the project, and has really been able to help us tell the story of how we're changing the fuel profile. Lomacasi Restoration Project is a nonprofit stewardship group that brought the contracting and workforce element to the partnership. And you kind of seeing the arrows in the middle, everything is kind of interwoven very tightly, but in all, under stewardship authority, the partners, not including the Forest Service, has actually generated a little over $700,000 in matching funds to the initial outlay of $6 million that we had to start the project with. Next slide, please. And under our, so we set up an organization to kind of review this. And this, if you hit the button one more time, our project review process has been really critical to being very transparent to the public. We have kind of a circular process to review all the implementation as we do it. So plans are developed, they're reviewed by the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service folks. We get their feedback, then we go to an independent implementation review team, a 3-person team that we identified just to give us an outside look at what we're doing. And then ultimately we go to public review, and this has included field trips and public meetings, and with just the whole intent of being completely transparent to the process and allowing everybody to have an opportunity to provide input as we're doing the implementation. And this has been somewhat unique for the Forest Service in that typically we will set up a contract and we'll have it all prepped, and then we'll go out for bids to implement. In this case, the partners are actually designing the project that falls within the record of decision that we have, and then also being responsible for implementation. So it's been kind of unique in that aspect for the Forest Service. Next slide. And I mentioned about the community engagement. We've had over 50 either events or tours, field trips. We have a website, a Facebook page for folks to provide comments. There's some interpretive signs that have been put up that actually were done by a volunteer group from the community that decided they wanted to help, and so they got the funding and they accomplished all the work to put those signs up. Next slide. The MultiParty Monitoring Plan, again, it was stakeholder driven. In other words, we asked folks, what is it that we need to know about the treatment? And as a result, we've collected a large amount of information so far, and that's continuing. We have, like I said, we have been in this project for 5 years now as a partnership, and we have another 5 to go, and we're working to get more funding for that to accomplish additional work. And the monitoring and the community engagement have played a key role in that. Over the last 2 years, the city has contributed $350,000 just for work on Forest Service land, in addition to the match that they give with providing city employees to help with the project. The Nature Conservancy has brought in funding and actually performed a very rigorous fire history and standard reconstruction study that has shown over history there was essentially a fire somewhere in the watershed every 2 years. But typically the average is about a 7-year fire return interval. And to date, we've gone within the watershed since 1959 without a large fire. There's been several fires on the outskirts of Ashland that have threatened the watershed, but so far it has survived those threats. So the bulk of the work that we're doing is really trying to kind of reduce some of the intensity of fire, and then also provide a avenue for the ecosystem recover after fire, which we think at some point is going to be inevitable. Last year we had a thunderstorm, and when you looked at the lightning map, it essentially covered most of the watershed, and we did end up with 20 starts within and adjacent to the watershed, which the biggest was, I think, only 5 acres. But with the snowpack that we've had the last 2 summers or winters, last year the Mount Ashland ski area failed to open, and this year it's been open very limited due to lack of snow. And so with the drought situation, we're looking at the potential for fire, as well as an increase in insect and disease issues. We have a lot of western pine beetle and flat-headed Douglas fir, flat-headed wood borer that are on city lands, and they're starting to move up into the watershed a little bit. So these treatments are critical, and the partnership that we've developed has really allowed this work to move forward. Probably the biggest issue that we face right now is the ability to use prescribed fire with very limited windows for burning, and a lot of area that we would like to implement fire on. So with that, I guess I'll wrap up for now and be happy to answer questions or and as we get into the rest of this discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Don, for that presentation. And again, a great example not only of using multiple stakeholders, but demonstrating how multiple tools in the toolbox are used to achieve the project's objectives. So we have Marcus Robles back online. And so, Marcus, if you could give us an overview of your project.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I just wanted to thank the Western Governors Association for inviting us to talk about our work here in the Arizona chapter of the Nature Conservancy. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about a scientific study that we did that looked at the connection between larger scale forest restoration and water and runoff. So I just wanted to acknowledge my colleagues on the paper that we have published, including some colleagues from Northern Arizona University. So if I could get to the next slide. So here's sort of the forest, water, fire challenge that we have in Arizona. We have above the Phoenix metro area in the central part of the map, there's been about 20% mortality of the forest that are the headwaters for the Verde and Salt watersheds, which in turn provide about 40% of the metro area's water supply. This includes 2 of the largest wildfires in state history, and to give you the size of the scale of these, you can actually see those on the map. They're both over 500,000 acres. So essentially, forests in our area are experiencing essentially a regional drying trend due to a combination of dense forests, drought conditions, and actually warmer temperatures in recent years. And this trend, if it continues, could have very serious consequences for both people and nature. Next slide, please. So the basic question that we asked in our study is that can large or bigger restoration efforts improve forest resilience and runoff? And so the context for this is that there is an ongoing restoration initiative called the Forest Restoration Initiative, which I'll call 4FRI from now on. And you can see that that area is composed of 4 national forests in central Arizona. Those are sort of highlighted in the darker green. And in phase 1 of this 4FRI project, or over the next 10 years, almost 600,000 acres will be treated, including the type of thinning treatments that are shown in the pictures. Next slide. And so essentially, we wanted the impetus of that forest restoration project was mostly for issues that have been discussed before, to reduce fire risk, etc. But they have a broader goal to improve resilience. So we wanted to look at another aspect of resilience and look at what might be the effects of this on runoff. So again, the geography of our study are these salt and verde watersheds, and particularly the ponderosa pine forest in these watersheds, which are shown in green in the map. And then the treatments that are planned over the next 10 years, those are shown in red. And to give you a sense of scale, that's about 150,000 acres that will be thinned over the next 10 years. We looked at the 2 biggest factors that drive runoff. So we looked at, we are in the desert Southwest, so we have quite a lot of variability in winter precipitation, and so we picked out from the 20th century record dry periods and wet periods and ran that through to get a range of runoff estimates. And we also looked at the scale and pace of restoration. So we ran scenarios that considered the 4FRI project as a basis, but we also asked the question, what would happen if you actually increase the scale and size of acres that are treated? How would that have an effect on runoff? In terms of the science, we essentially adapted an empirically derived model from historical experiments. So the picture at the bottom shows some weirs that were actually put in place in this Beaver Creek watershed, which if you go back to the map, you can see is within our study area. These were historical experiments conducted in the 1950s by the U.S. Forest Service to measure runoff responses to forest treatments. So we used a refined version of that model and the actual thinning prescriptions from the 4FRI to ask this question. Next slide, please. Overall, this is our main result, that all the scenarios we ran led to about a 20% increase in runoff in the headwater watersheds where thinning would occur. And this actually included considerations of both drought and wet conditions. So the symbols on the left were simulations that were under drought conditions for winter precipitation, and the symbols on the right are assuming wetter conditions. And so in both cases, there was about a 20% increase in runoff. Next slide. And so to summarize a little bit, or to put our study into a little bit of context, our studies found that at least in the case of watershed health and runoff, accelerated thinning that's been contemplated in 4FRI and even at scales beyond that could improve forest resilience. As I mentioned before, it could increase runoff in headwater watersheds by 20%. The benefits would be more modest for downstream users, potentially increasing the current municipal supply in Phoenix by 1 to 9%, and overall flows in the Salt and Verde River by 1 to 3%. And those numbers are lower just because these are huge watersheds. The majority of the watersheds are not ponderosa, and so as you increase the scale, there are significant but modest effects on supply. Taking a step back and just looking at the literature, we found that there's lots of emerging evidence summarized with some of the bullets of these other studies that forest thinning can increase resilience in other ways in terms of reducing drought stress and fire risk. Many of these studies were conducted at the plot level. A few of them were conducted at larger scales, and so more work needs to be done on that. But we concluded on our paper that accelerated thinning is basically a way to hit the reset button on ecosystem resilience that provides managers and cities and towns more options in the future, whereas the current pace of restoration might lead to more risk for the larger wildfires that we've been seeing. And also, thinning is maybe one of the only, perhaps most effective management options at our disposal to help these forests continue to provide benefits to people and recover from wildfires, droughts, and water stress. So I think I just have one more slide. I just wanted to indicate here that our report is available for download at this website that's circled here. That's azconservation.org. And it's also on the journal where we published, and that's called PLOS One. Please feel free to contact myself or my colleague, Rob Marshall, if you have any further questions. I just wanted to mention, and this has already been alluded to in both previous presentations, that our other chapters in the West are working on the forest-water connection. In New Mexico, there is an effort to create a Rio Grande Water Fund, which would be a financial vehicle to generate more funding for restoration treatments. And there's some legislation in the state legislature to kind of move that forward. And in California, our colleagues have just published a new report on the Sierra Nevadas and found that the value of increased hydropower generation and water supply could cover between 1/3 and the full cost of thinning, depending on a low or high water response. And the contact information for each of these efforts is also shown on that slide. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, and thank you, Marcos, and absolutely wrapped it up with a great third presentation, and certainly water yield through forest management is something I think we're going to be hearing a lot more of. But quite frankly, all three programs, I was taking notes because I want to certainly take ideas back to California. I think these were very distinct but very innovative projects to address forest management and water. So what we want to do here is we have a limited time left. We want to try to accommodate as many questions to the panelists as we can, and also want to encourage, although a question may be directed to any particular panelist, that the other members can certainly weigh in. But keeping in mind we want to address as many questions as possible, we'll try to keep our answers as short as possible and keep moving through them. So with that, what I'd like to do is throw the first question to Alan at the City of Santa Fe, and it has to do with rates. And the question is, Alan, did you have to increase the rates to fund this investment plan? And if so, how much were customers billed for that support, and would that show up on their utility bill?
That's a good question. So originally, with the Nature Conservancy and how this was designed for us and our customer ratepayer base to pay for these services in conjunction with the Forest Service was the idea of payment for ecosystem services. And, to the Nature Conservancy's credit, they did a lot of great groundwork on sampling our community and the community needs. And so the idea was originally there was going to be what was called a Source Water Protection Fund, and that was about a cost of 65 cents per customer or per connection, and we have about 32,000 customers throughout the city. And that would be a charge that would be similar to like a singular charge on the utility bill. It ended up being a transition where we actually already had 8.25% increase because of infrastructure improvements. For 5 years, it was 2008, 5 years moving forward. So really the way we're paying for it now is the customer is still paying into our collection agreement and our commitment to this plan, but it's primarily through CIP funds at this point. And again, it works out to about $250,000 per year. So that's kind of the answer of yes, it did. It was directly being paid for by customers, but it didn't end up being a line item on the bill, but more of a part of the rate increase that we had already incurred through our governing body. But again, the customers are paying for this program, so it is of direct benefit, and they do see the results.
Outstanding. Thanks, Alan. That's certainly, to get that level of public support to connect the watershed with their drinking water is certainly a huge success for the program. The next question is for Marcos, and the Salt Verde paper said that the water runoff benefits declined after about 6 years. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, great. Thanks. That's a great question, and in purposes of brevity, I tried to keep some details out, but that's an important caveat, which is the historical watershed experiments in this area did show that the effects of thinning on runoff diminish over time and sort of disappear after about 6 years. And the thought on that is that these forests sort of regrow and the evaporation and transpiration that benefits sort of decline over time. And so for our particular scenarios, let's say we ran a 10-year scenario in which we had a certain number of acres treated every year. We estimated that the 20% increase would be over a 15-year time frame. So if you can imagine, in year one, you would get the benefits of that thinning in year one. In year two, you would get the benefits of year one plus year two, et cetera, et cetera. But after about 5 or 6 years, when the thinning stops, then the declines the increases in runoff will go away. And so that's why we wanted to emphasize that this was more of a reset button on resilience in terms of providing a short-term temporary benefit. There is some thought that maintenance treatments such as prescribed fire, which are planned for all of the acres in the 4-5 program, will sustain those benefits, but that has not been, more study needs to be done on that to see if that is actually the case.
Great, thank you, Marcos. So want to next up throw a question to Dawn, and it's something that's certainly high priority in California as well, but it's prescribed fire. And I'm in particular interested in knowing, was there resistance within the community to the use of control burns or prescribed fire, and how did you respond to those concerns, and how would you see efforts like this gaining acceptance in larger communities or other urban areas where there may be reaction to that?
Well, for the most part, the city of Ashland is actually comfortable with fire, and in large part due to the fact that the city has actually been using prescribed fire on some of their lands, and that's on a much smaller scale, 20 to 30 acre burn here and there, but they at least have seen the smoke and are feeling comfortable with fire. There obviously are those concerns of the idea of controlled burning and whether you can really control fire and what are those effects. But with the city's help, we've been able to this point, mostly accomplish pile burning. But the bigger issue we have in the Ashland area has to do with smoke. And Ashland is part of the larger Rogue Valley, which is a sensitive smoke receptor area. And the Forest Service isn't allowed to put add any additional smoke into the valley when we burn. And so with most of the flows coming from the south, which lead smoke to the valley, it becomes challenging to find windows when we can actually burn. And so a lot of our work right now is working with the region and the Oregon Department of Forestry to figure out how we can accomplish burns. And there's been a lot of work in Northern California with the Prescribed Fire Council, and the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council is picking up steam, and so we're going to be working with them. But I think overall the effects of burning are recognized as positive for the most part. The challenge is all that smoke in the air.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Don. Next question for Alan. It has to do with where do you see similar proactive approaches to municipal watershed forest management occurring throughout the West? Is this something that is catching on? If not, why do you think there are challenges to this happening?
Well, the challenges, I would say similar to what Don spoke to is, for us, our community is, comfortable for fire. Nobody, is ever 100%. But again, it's the smoke. The smoke becomes an issue, and we've had, ever since the 2000s, a couple instances where you get an inversion layer, and it does affect the community. The smoke will come from the east back down towards the city in the west. So again, that's a big component of our watershed management plan is getting that outreach, education, communication with the Forest Service and the public before we have controlled burns, even if they're small acreage and they're just doing pile burning. We always want to communicate that and get the goodwill of the public behind us, and especially for us, the community, since they're paying for it. Other areas, again, I think Marcos mentioned it with the Rio Grande Water Fund with the Nature Conservancy. I mean, that's really looking at, for us, around the Rio Grande Basin all the way into southern Colorado, sort of putting the pieces of the puzzle together so that we're connecting larger landscapes instead of just small pieces where the Forest Service is active or Bureau of Land Management or other public entities in partnership with municipalities or even private lands. And you're starting to see that more and more. An example is, I think a good one that I learned of was in Flagstaff. They actually have watershed protection that was, it's financed through a bond measure, which means basically the community voted for it, and it's a $10 million bond measure that was started in 2013. So there are programs. I think Denver also has one similar to ours where Denver Waters, their customers are paying into the plan. It's a forest to faucets plan. I think it came out to about 33 cents per bill. But again, it's just having the community, the citizens comfortable with the treatments and the fire, and more importantly, just educating them about the smoke effect. And that's going to be less than possible large catastrophic wildfire.
Excellent, thank you. Alan, next up, and the presentation by Marcos provided some pretty incredible data on water yield, and to kind of dive into that just a bit more, Marcos, can you explain the result of a 20% increase in runoff even during a drought? Why do you think the result occurred, and what are the ramifications?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually had an extra slide for this, so I'm not able to see that, but it's not that slide. It's a slide that has kind of 4 panels, and essentially this is it. Essentially, one of the drought scenarios that we're showing is on the left, and so what we were able to find is it's sort of the definition of a drought, which is over a multi-year period. Our scenarios were 15, 20, 30 years. There are below average conditions in winter precipitation, which was a big driver of runoff. But when we looked at the historic droughts, again, we were relying on the historic record in this watershed. We found that even within historic droughts of the 1950s or the current droughts, there are years within that 15-year time span that have above average precipitation. And that's what the black bars are showing in the lower left-hand panel. And it was those years that have above average precipitation in an overall drought that led to the increases in runoff in our modeling exercise. So interannual variability, variability driven by El Nino and La Nina, which we hear a lot about, can actually have a benefit in terms of leading to these increases in runoff and droughts. The second thing I would say is that the absolute increases during drought periods were much less than the increases during wet periods, and that makes a lot of sense. And so they would probably have less benefit for downstream users, but would be really important for water-dependent natural resources and wildlife in those headwaters that would be suffering from those drought impacts.
Great, thank you. Really, I want to throw a question out to any of the panelists to respond. It has to do with the economics piece, and certainly we've seen in California there's an endless supply of work to do to manage the forest, and in the process it generates a large volume of material coming off the landscape, and we are constantly struggling with the ability to help pay the way of that material, whether it's actual commercial logs or biomass that historically may be burned on site. Are you finding that there are markets for the amount of material that's being removed from these large-scale thinning and fuels projects? And if not, how are you dealing with the material? Maybe just start with Alan, if you're whomever.
Sure. Well, our situation was somewhat unique because being that our municipal watershed is in the upper reaches, and again, it's east towards the mountain front of our city, there's really one road in to the watershed, and there's another one further to the north, but it's fairly limited access. So in the 2001 Environmental Impact Statement, the Forest Service finalized that option, the availability of taking wood out, or even for commercial purposes, or even for community fuel wood. The decision was made that the impacts to the road and the communities to the east side, the stakeholders, the communities really said, this is not something we're interested in. Also, the quality of the wood wasn't, because it's sort of small diameter trees, because it's quite dense in there, wasn't ideal. So the option was not to remove woody debris and to actually leave it on the landscape. And some of the first treatments were done as mastication or leaving biomass on the ground. Therefore, it was important to introduce prescribed burning to cycle through those nutrients throughout the forest. But we had sort of a unique situation again where commercial availability and also community fuel wood was not chosen as an alternative. Other landscapes it is in New Mexico, so it's a little bit of a difference for us.
Yeah, and I can speak to the Ashland project. The challenge that we have is very few roads out there, and most of the wood that we removed had to be done with a helicopter, and the value of the wood obviously couldn't pay for the cost of the helicopter, so it becomes a challenge to fund that. But we're able to get out 3.5 million board feet and send it to local mills, and under the Stewardship Authority, the receipts that we got from that, we were able to turn back in to offset some of the costs and actually treat additional acres in the watershed from the original funding that we got. And I think one of the unique things that we kind of found in the project was using the helicopter and doing a full treatment in the stand, even though we had to offset some of that cost, the total cost of that operation was actually very similar to just doing non-commercial work. And so, it kind of becomes a little bit of a different paradigm for the Forest Service as to fund that kind of treatment where you use the value to offset the cost as opposed to just giving money to do non-commercial work. And so we're trying to do some more digging into those actual costs to see if there's some value there in shifting that idea.
So with that, and I will just double check if Marcos has anything else he would like to weigh on that. And if not, I have a question. Would like to throw the next one to Marcos.
Oh, go ahead, Don. I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, very good. So could you, and again, kind of intrigued by the discussion, could you briefly touch on the concept of ecosystem services? How can forest managers, ecologists, and water managers come together to strengthen the messaging behind the economic benefits of forest restoration to acquire funding for projects like those in Ashland or Santa Fe?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so actually the framing of our paper, we focused on runoff because we had an opportunity, frankly, to look at that using these historical experiments. But really the framing of our whole paper became much more about that large-scale restoration can have multiple benefits and also some constraints as well that need to be looked at, but that typically usually one benefit or another is emphasized when really what we think the point is that in terms of runoff, in terms of reduced wildfire risk, in terms of reduced erosion and sedimentation after large wildfires, there are many ecological benefits and also economic benefits to bring to bear that large-scale forest restoration can bring to bear. And we at the Nature Conservancy with collaborators are trying to show all those benefits both on the science side and both on the economic side, and then we're bringing that information to municipalities and cities, as it was an example in Santa Fe, but also in other places, and in Oregon as well, but also we're doing that in Arizona to really make the case that that the sum is greater than the parts, and it's really when you only think about these things all together that you recognize that what the benefits are. And another way to answer that is the increases in water yields in and of themselves are probably not enough to warrant the level of investment that would be required to reach the scale that's needed to see those runoff benefits. However, when you package it with the reduced fire risk and erosion and sedimentation and the cost of cleanup, et cetera, it's hard to argue that doing this large-scale forest restoration is not only needed, but also can be beneficial for multiple services that the forests provide.
Thank you, Marcos. And maybe just quickly throwing it back to Alan and or Dawn for maybe your comments on that, on your perspective.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that a little bit. Again, we're in a unique situation where we don't have the economic availability of wood product coming out, but it's interesting for us also as managers just to see some of the evidence. And again, we're a unique watershed. It's closed, so we don't have a lot of public usage, and also our treatments are sort of lower down in the watershed. They're around our reservoirs, which is, pinon, juniper, woodland, it's ponderosa pine, and then as you increase in elevation, you go to mixed conifer, and then in the higher elevations, you have spruce fir. So a lot of our treatments, it's not necessarily that we see, a lot of runoff per se. It's just with those changes of the treatments, you're getting a lot more infiltration. It slows down flows. You get a longer hydrograph. And we've had a traditional paired basin study that led to this whole effort. We see similar evidence from the data on that. But again, it calls out to the fact that the improvement of forest health, it really helps us with erosional issues. You get grasses and forbs in, and it really helps improvement of water quality, which is a big part of the management process for us as a water division. So it's helping our source supply on water quality, less cost of treatment with erosional issues or possible post-fire impacts. So that's a big part of seeing the results, and we're just into the first 4 years of a collection agreement, so we'd like to see further evidence of sort of those impacts, and again, economically, just not having the impact of wildfire, but also having a pristine water source for our drinking water supply, and instead of having to deal with erosional issues and sedimentation.
Thanks, Alan. And John, briefly, do any comments from your perspective that hadn't already been covered?
Not really. I think even some of the same things that Alan talks about are one thing that the idea of ecosystem services is really gaining traction in Ashland, and because of the water resource and also the high amount of recreation use it gets, as well as the late successional habitat it provides. And so there's a realization that there's benefits to the forest and benefits from the forest, and like I say, that's taking traction pretty well in Ashland.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we could probably go on for several more hours with the interest and the amount of questions, and with these three panelists. We are up against the end of the window, and what I want to do is first off thank all three panelists for their commitment to this program. Many of the questions that were coming in were being answered either directly or through the follow-up discussions, and in many cases they're being answered online, which is the beauty of these online webinars. So with that, I would like to turn it back over to Carly Brown for closing comments.
Thank you, Chief Pimlott, and thank you so much for moderating today's discussion. We were really pleased with what we heard today, and thank you also to our panelists for joining us. I'd just like to remind everybody that we have been recording this webinar, and so that will be posted on YouTube, and we'll send out a link to that on Friday. I also want to just put in a plug for our fifth and final webinar, which will be in 2 weeks. So the same time on April 8th, please log in for a webinar on why variation in hydrology and legal structures means that drought looks different across the West. We'll also, in that email on Friday with a link to the webinar, include a request for your case studies and best practices if you would like to have those featured on the WGA Drought Forum website. So please do look for that email. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.